I think I was brought up, like most people that go into art, with this grand notion of all the things art is supposed to do. And as you grow up in life, you are slowly ground down by the realities of what all the things that art can't do. And I think in between those two things is a studio activity in which you continue to have aspirations despite proof to the alternative. Start off as an artist, and the first thing you do is you learn all your licks. You learn how to the craft of making something, and then everybody tells you, well, then you have to explore personal experience, and then you do that, and slowly you realize that your personal experience really isn't that interesting, and that there's a whole bunch of other things at play. So then you spend the rest of your life entering into dialogue with the discourse, and at a certain point in time, even the discourse becomes somewhat stale to you. You realize that where the crux of making is where, in that, again, this dynamic between me and discourse, or my functioning within the larger discourse. And so I just decided that I realized at a certain point in time, like maybe we all do, that these paintings came out of a deeply complicated relationship with art making that I have. I couldn't figure out why it was that certain aspects of late modernism either really bugged me, but also seemed very comfortable to me. And it was because I like to tell friends that I grew up in the last great wasteland of modernity, where all the aesthetic high ground that had been won by all the major figures of modernism found their way into public schools and hospitals by way of super graphics and bad batik and brutalist architecture. I mean, I grew up in the suburbs, in the great social experiment that was Scarborough, Ontario. And my first relationship with the notion of modern art came through those institutional graphics. And it's no surprise to me that moment where modernism entered the institutional sphere was kind of key to my relationship with painting practice. And I think I riff off that a great deal, because I think that is the moment. I often try and find the conventions that I find to be, as Ross Bleckner says, trying to find dead conventions, like op art and super graphics and elements of the graphics that might have come from the era of disco. I'm looking for those moments, and I'm trying to use those as signifiers for a problem, but I'm trying to paint them as earnestly and meaningfully and as beautifully as I can. I backed into abstract painting from work that was based much more in language and the problem of language. My problem of language is that gulf between a personal experience and a public expression. One of the reasons I specifically chose to work within the idioms of abstraction is because abstraction exposes the functions of language in a much more overt way than perhaps representation does. Now, representation obviously has, functions semiotically, but for me, I wanted to pare it down as much as I could, and the gesture and color were the kind of elemental signs in which I could build my paintings. These works are very much tied also into the history of Expressionism, especially abstract Expressionism, but they signal their contemporary position by being skeptical about what it means to make an expressionist mark, the notion of what constitutes subjectivity in a gesture. That's the jumping off point for a lot of these paintings, is that I've tried to make that my complicated relationship, not only with abstraction, but with the notion of expressionism, with subjectivity, with the personal and the public, the private and the political spaces, obvious, or at least obvious to me. One of the strategies that I tend to employ is I tend to decorate gestural marks. In other words, what I do is I take what might be a traditional sort of expressionist mark, I put it down, and then I decorate it. And the process of decorating, ornamenting the gesture in some ways calls into question, or it does something to it. It prettifies it, it takes it out of the realm of, let's say, the individual and makes it much more a public, about display. And then at the same time, I also tend to have this relationship with things like supergraphics, which get that one could paint very clearly and plainly and neatly, but I have a tendency to paint very roughly and crudely, and I've said that, to use the analogy from popular music, that I seem to want to punk my disco and disco my punk. In other words, I seem to want to take invert expectations in both those realms. I tend to call into question the veracity of an expressionist gesture being highly subjective. At the same time, I seem to call into question the kind of institutional quality of graphics by allowing my hand to be in play in the making of them. And one of the things that's happened with the groove fucker paintings is that instead of having a sort of a uniform field that's usually of a uniform color in which things are placed and things will kind of situate themselves spatially, the groove fucker paintings start with pattern on them. And so that everything that goes on top literally sits on top. Things come out, they don't go back very easily. Once you have a really activated surface, everything you apply on top of it looks like someone's been throwing paint bombs at it. It really sits up. And again, it's accumulation. It's not positioning in space. And I think that was one of the things I was looking for, was the idea of constant accumulation, where the notion of collage is taken well past its traditional idea of like a juxtaposition of one thing on top of another, and instead it just accumulates crap. And the crap is the paint, and the paint gets thicker and more viscous as it goes along. I'm not a nihilist, and I'm not by nature a cynic, I don't think. So it's hard to make abstract paintings that don't look either naive or incredibly cynical. And to be somewhere in between the two, to be skeptical but hopeful, to suggest that one of the reasons why these things are not done on Photoshop, projected and just painted like paint by numbers, is because at the end of the day, work, labor means something to me. The human act of making the decision to go in the studio, to add paint, to make mistakes, to exhibit that kind of basic frailty and indecision is hugely important to me.